Hey folks, welcome to the Yanji Ross Show. I'm here with Bud Hennigan today. But welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Um, Bud is actually a really great guy. I don't know if any of you remember this, but a few months ago, I asked for help for a podcast, and there were a lot of people who were reaching out to me, and Bud sent me a message and asked me and offered me to help me out with a podcast because he actually is the host of a pretty cool podcast called A Boundless World. And so now, fast forward 4 months, I'm sitting here having an interview with Bud. We were finally able to schedule it after, like, I guess we have 9 hours of time difference. Is that right, Bud?
Yeah, I think it's about 9 hours, a little bit of back and forth. You're finally able to make it happen.
Yeah, so I'm really glad. And I thought, wait a minute, if Bud is offering to help me out with a podcast, I might as well just record it and record his lessons learned, what he went through. And then I realized, wait a minute, like Bud really has a cool story as well. So I don't want to talk about exclusively about his podcast experience, but also about his life because it sounds like a pretty amazing life you had so far, Bud.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to share my story.
So a quick question: what did you do right before the show, Bud?
So right before the show, I believe I launched back in November, and so at that time I was actually participating in a program called Exosphere.
No. I mean, what did you do right before, like this show? Right now we're recording.
Oh, what did I do right before this show? Okay,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
yeah. I know
I
it's
actually
a tricky question because you never expect it.
I actually just got back from the gym.
Oh, really? Oh, great.
Yeah.
So you're working out. I came back from running a bit. Cool.
Yeah,
So,
I'm not a big runner these days, but I just went to the gym and lifted some weights, trying to lose a little bit of weight on my gut. So,
oh really? You gained some weight a little bit, or?
yeah, I mean, I've always on and off with my weight, so I'm just trying to get back in shape. So I'm trying to go to the gym here every day, lift some weights or do some sprints, that kind of stuff.
Okay, interesting. Have you heard from of the app called Freeletics?
I actually did. I signed up for a little bit, and I, for whatever reason, didn't get hooked very much. I definitely played around with it,
Okay.
but so you just kind of do my own thing at the gym.
Oh, all right, interesting. Because they come from my hometown, Munich. So, okay, I just wanted to know
Really?
if it's already over in the U.S. So apparently you heard about it.
Yeah, it was in my email somehow, and I definitely signed up. I gave it a test go.
Yeah. Okay, great. So before I introduce you, Bud, or talk a little bit too much about you, there's a great quote I found on one of your in one of your writings, and it says, "You change the world by not hiding from who you are." So, Bud, who are you really?
That's a pretty loaded question to start off the interview.
Of
Uh,
course,
to be
always
honest,
loaded.
I'm just a guy who's wanting to make a difference in the world when it comes down to it, and I'm passionate about a lot of different things, most notably storytelling, technology, and marketing. So those are kind of my three kind of tiers. I'm also really fascinated with psychology, and so in everything I do, I'm always trying to bring value to people, connect with people. I'm a relationship guy at heart. I love networking, not the terrible version of networking you're probably thinking about right now, but just connecting with people, adding value to their lives, and so in my work and in my personal life, that's what I try to do is just always try to leave the person I'm interacting with, whether it be a family member or friend, better off than when I met them. And not in like a I'm better than you way, but just like trying to understand them. What are they going through? How can I help them? Or how can they help me? Or how can we make this a mutually beneficial relationship? And so personally and professionally, that's my goal is just to add value and really make a difference, as cliche as that sounds.
Interesting. So, why did you stop writing? Because when I read one or two or three articles of yours, and I thought they were like a lot better than what I would probably ever be able to do. So, what was the reason that you stopped doing that? Because if I got it right, you were doing this blog or having this blog for like 7 or 8 years. So, what would happen? Why did you
Yeah,
stop writing?
it's a good question, and I'm still trying to struggle with it. I still consider myself a writer deep down. I do some writing and just haven't really published it. But to be honest with you, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, it's mostly fear, you know. I had a little bit of a dark time the last few years, kind of suffered through some depression, that kind of stuff. And intuitively, I just felt like, why should I be writing? It sounds silly when I'm saying it out loud, and it's one of the first times I've actually said it out loud. So this is kind of an interesting story arc we have here. But ultimately, I just felt like I wasn't worth writing and intuitively I know I'm a good writer. Like people have told me that I enjoy writing, and so I kind of just let it go, you know. And definitely I found, if looking back, the times I'm happiest are when I'm writing and are when I'm sharing the stories.
Yeah.
But I was in such a kind of dark place, and I've kind of gotten out of it recently. But I was in such a dark place, I was just afraid that people would think like this guy's just depressed, and why should I listen to him, you know? And so ultimately, it's just about getting back to the basics, writing and publishing these often scary truths, as you do. I'm a huge fan of your work, and that's one of the reasons I respect you so much. Is a lot of the times you're just writing what's really on your heart, and I think that's what made me a successful writer in the past, and I'm working really, really hard to get back into that.
Yeah, it's interesting that because for me it started the other way around. I actually started writing when I was down on my knees. I started writing when I was when I quit my job. I decided to write a book. I had I never wrote a book before. I had no clue how to do it. For like 5 or 6 months, I was really I didn't know. I left the house. I went to the university library to work on my book, and I went home in the evening, and I didn't do shit. So I came home, and then at one point, my girlfriend broke up with me. So she was pretty much, and I moved in with her because I didn't have an apartment anymore. I moved back from New York to Munich, and we moved into into her apartment. And at one point, yeah, we broke up, and I was like, wait a minute, like, what the hell just happened over the past 6, 7 months? And that's when I started writing. So for me, writing was more or less like a cure. Like everything that I write is the stuff that's deep down in my heart, and it helps me to get back up again. So it's really interesting that for you it's the exact opposite, that you did it before and then you stopped it when you were down on your knees. And
I don't know if that's entirely accurate. Let me jump in there real fast. I don't know if that's entirely accurate to say, because there's been different points. And to be honest, I actually started blogging after a tragedy in my life back in high school, which was 6 or 7, 8 years ago. I think it was 2008. So actually, my best friend died in a jet ski accident when I was living in Shanghai, China, going to high school over there. And that really just kind of really, really rocked my world, because up until that point, I was 15, 16 at the time. I always loved writing, but I wasn't really doing anything. And once my friend passed away, it really kind of just hit me, and I was like, man, like, as cliche as it sounds, like, life is short. You don't really know when your time is. And so I just started writing, you know. And again, I think similar themes with you and I started like sharing my, like, what was going on with my thoughts, like psychology, like how to find happiness, all this kind of stuff. And it kind of just really took off. And I was pretty consistent for the first 2, 3, 4 years of the blog. And I actually found some pretty notable, quote unquote, success early on. And then I kind of just lost the momentum, and then it's very, very hard, in my opinion, to kind of regain that momentum. It's not impossible, but kind of just on and off, and I kind of just an endless cycle of self-pity. And so it's not something I'm proud of necessarily, but I think a lot of writers or aspiring writers out there sometimes deal with that, and it's the idea of like, who's going to listen to me write? And I think you and I both know, and you just kind of share your heart on your sleeves in an authentic, truly authentic way, good things happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow, it's an interesting story. So I can just share, like, for example, why I publish so much stuff, and also like this positive sort of circle it sometimes gets me into. Like, I know it sounds stupid, but when someone likes or shares your stuff, it kind of feels good, right?
It feels great.
What I realized over time is that writing and publishing it over and over again, and but only focusing on the writing actually pushes me even more. It sort of starts a positive circle, but at the same time it can also start a negative circle, right? If nobody likes your stuff and shares your stuff. So I can definitely definitely feel you what's going on, what has been going on, more or less in your life. So that's wow. But the Shanghai, so yeah, I know you grew up like. You lived in so many different places. Like, I even lived in Shanghai as well. Where did you live in Shanghai, actually?
Yeah, I actually lived on Pudong. So Shanghai is split by a big river. So there's Puxi and Pudong. I lived in Pudong, and I was in Shanghai for 2 years.
Okay.
My dad worked for an oil and energy company, and so we transferred over there my junior, which is the third year of high school in the U.S. And so I was there for 2 years, and then my family continued to stay over there for another 3 or 4. While I came back to the United States for university. In addition to Shanghai, I lived in Europe when I was really young, so I lived in the Netherlands, but mostly grew up in Texas. But I've been able to live other places as well. The last probably year and a half, early on this year, I lived in Chile, South America. So I've been super fortunate and blessed to have traveled to a lot of different places, and it's definitely impacted the person I am today.
Like what do you think? Like how did it impact you? Like what is a good thing? What is one good thing and one bad thing?
So honestly, like I try to frame it in mostly positives. I'll have to think on the bad part, but I think just moving around and being exposed to a variety of different cultures and things really opened me up. And again, cliche as that sounds, in Texas, I was kind of close-minded. You know, I'd grown up in Texas for 8 or 9 years, so I was kind of just used to the way things operated in Texas, how the U.S. was. I remember when I lived in Europe when I was really young, so unfortunately, I don't remember most of the culture aspect of it. I was just a little kid. But I remember when my dad's like, "Hey, bud, we're moving to China." I was like, "Man, are they're like communists? They don't they have like do they have internet? Like all these like
When was that?
weird."
In what year?
This was I can't remember the year. I was junior, so I think it was probably, let's see, 2007, 2008, I believe, maybe
Okay.
2006. So it's when I was like 15 or 16. I lived there for 2 years. I'm 23, almost 24 now. But even at 15, 16, I was just very close-minded. And so moving to China and getting to travel was a really great experience for me. In addition, living in Asia, you also have access to travel to a lot of different countries while you're there. So I was able to go to Russia and Vietnam, the Philippines, that kind of stuff. And so that opened up a lot of doors for me in just terms of self-exploration.
Okay. So what was like one thing you think was a bit negative?
Negative. You kind of miss some certain aspects of just growing up, you know, like sometimes, for example, in China, a lot of when you go shopping and things at supermarkets, you have to negotiate and things like that. On one hand, it was good for me to learn how to negotiate, but on the other hand, it was kind of like a little bit petty, but it was just kind of time consuming and frustrating sometimes to always negotiate when you're going out to buy a T-shirt or something like
Yeah.
that. So it's fun, right? But like at the same time, there's just things you take for granted. I wasn't a huge fan. I definitely miss the American food. I love Chinese food for sure, but I definitely miss some aspects of it. But probably the biggest thing was just being able to. I think I did a decent job at this, but staying in contact with your friends back home in the U.S. it can be kind of difficult. And when I went back to university in the United States, my parents stayed in China, my family stayed in China, so that was also a little bit lonely throughout college. I was kind of on my own. Fortunately, I had some family who lived near my university in Missouri, but it was kind of lonely that to have your family on the other side of the world.
Hmm. So why did you decide to not stay in China? Like
Ultimately, I mean, I never had the intention to stay there for university. I had always just wanted to go back to the States. At the time in high school, I wanted to be a journalist. Surprise, surprise. So I ended up going to the University of Missouri, which had a fantastic journalism program.
hmm
But throughout college, I actually switched to marketing, kind of just switched it a little bit. I felt the journalism to some degree was just not up to times, you know, like I had been blogging and things like this, and lots of people didn't even know what blogs were back in that day, you know. And so I just wanted to learn how to market and just kind of get the business aspect of it down.
Yeah. So what do you think? Would you recommend young kids like to go to or like someone who just graduated to go to China and just see what's out there, or like what's your personal feeling about that?
Yeah, I'm definitely very, very pro travel. That doesn't even have to be China. I think it can be any country that you haven't been to before. There's many countries I would love to travel to, but China's a fantastic start. I know it's a very, very unique country, and I was fortunate enough to have a few of my buddies from the U.S. come fly over for a summer or two and really explore China with me, and they loved it. And I think it just exposes you to different beliefs and perspectives, and you just get a taste for what's out there, you know. Um, I mean, travel can make you a better person, and if you don't have the means to travel at this point, like that's okay. Like it doesn't make you a bad person by any means, but I highly recommend people travel as much as they can if that's something they're interested in. It really has made me a better person, I can say without a doubt.
Yeah, it's interesting because we also share a similar story like when it comes to this because I was also in China. I don't know why, but at some point I just started a business, and as you said, like the negotiating, it was a pain in the ass. Like starting and running a business in China was like one of the worst and one of the best experiences of my life. It was really, man, I learned so much about like how business works and how we have no clue, or how, for example, I had no clue about anything. So it was really like the best school of my life, more or less, that I had in China. So I also still sort of feel about and think about going back to China, maybe learning the language. By the way, do you speak Chinese or?
Yeah. It's just a quick aside. I remember, and I'll jump into the language here in a bit, but I remember when I first got over there, we went to a market like to buy T-shirts and things like that. And I had no idea the concept of negotiating, you know. In the U.S., you just go to a store, buy it, and you can do that in China, but a lot of the markets you negotiate. And I remember my mom was like a shark negotiator. She's trying to get every last penny, you know. And I remember like, Mom, just like give them the money they want, because they ask for a lot of money in the beginning and you negotiate. I was like, just give them the money they want, like they're poor and all this like misconceptions, you know. But that's just how the way they work. And so it's really interesting. By the end of my time in China, I was also trying to get every last penny. But in terms of learning the language, unfortunately, I didn't take learning Chinese super seriously. At 15, 16, I was kind of just focused on girls, that kind of stuff, partying over there. But I did learn a little bit. I was conversational to some extent. I kind of understood what was going on. I could travel, get in taxis, go around the city, but I wasn't fluent by any means, which is something I somewhat regret in terms of not really focusing there. But Chinese is definitely a very interesting language, and it's very beneficial too.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about maybe going back at one point, like teaching English and at the same time learning Chinese in the small village. That's also on my agenda for, I don't know, maybe next year or the year after it.
Do it, man. That would be fantastic. Maybe I'll have to come join you.
Definitely. I'm actually gonna go to Asia on the 2nd of September. I'm gonna stay there for a few months, like check it out, like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand.
Yeah, those are the countries I never really hit up. My family did while I was back at college, so I was a little upset with them for that. But I've never been to Thailand or anything, and all those Southeast Asia countries, which I'm really hoping to do in the next couple of years.
Yeah. Huh. So when did you start exactly with it is a very quick change the subject. When did you start writing or your podcast? When was that? Was it like a year ago or 1.5 years ago?
The podcast was, I believe, I kind of started in November, maybe launched in December. I don't know the exact day. Just some stats there. It's probably been downloaded 5, 6, 7,000 times right now. Kind of took a small hiatus, but I've interviewed maybe 30, 35 people so far.
Wow, that's a good number. And so, how did you get in touch with all of these people that you wanted to invite, or was it people that are already reading your blog, or completely new people?
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of Twitter. I use Twitter all the time, and I'd say 95%, I don't know exactly, 95% came through Twitter. I remember when I was gearing up to launch a podcast, I like asked my friends, I was like, hey, if you've got an interesting story to share, I'd love to have you on. And I think within an hour, 5 people said, like, done, you know, and there's my 5 first guests. So fortunately, I was able to kind of build that kind of social network up through just years of being on Twitter and adding value, as we discussed before. And so most of them were just relationships there. And I've been able to keep in contact with a lot of, even though I don't blog as much these days, I remember I made a lot of those relationships 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so I was able to kind of leverage that, so to speak. All blogging, yeah.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
Go ahead.
Because it's like, for me, it's the same thing. Like, most of the guests on my show were people that either read my blog or I got somehow in touch with. So it's an interesting parallels here. So do you think you stopped, or was it a coincidence that you stopped writing while you started making a podcast, or was it on purpose?
So I kind of stopped writing a little bit before that anyways, maybe one article here or there, but mostly just focused on the podcast. I definitely think you can do both at one time. I don't think you can do you don't have to do either or. But definitely the focus was for podcasting. And so one of the things I did there is I actually wanted to, just being in like the online world and things like that, I'd kind of known podcasting was going to be big, and it already had kind of its peak early on and then kind of died off. But I'd wanted to start a podcast for probably 2 or 3 years, and it just goes to show procrastination can really hurt you. And finally, while I was in Chile, the group of entrepreneurs I was hanging out with and working with, they really just kicked my ass, and they're like, dude, just get it done. Like, quit being like lazy, you know? And so finally I decided to invest in it. And I was able to invest in a podcasting course by a popular podcaster, John Lee Dumas. And so that really kind of lit like a fire underneath my butt to like really focus in on it.
What was he called?
John Lee Dumas. He has a really popular podcast called Entrepreneurs on Fire. It was one of the first podcasts that was 7 days a week when it first started. I think it's 5 days a week now, with just interviews from successful business people, that kind of stuff. And he's actually teaching a course now. on how to get up and running, and it's kind of a support community kind of group. And so I decided to invest that. I think that was close to $1,000 over a year, which is a pretty hefty investment, which is I'm long-term committed to podcasting. Again, just a quick note, I've taken a little bit of a break. I was traveling with my girlfriend, that kind of stuff. But definitely going to get back into it and kind of ramp it up again. But just aside, like whenever you want to do something, you really have to invest in it, whether that be writing 1,000 words a day, very popular, or if you decide to do a podcast, like take it seriously, you know.
So what are your lessons from reflecting about yourself? Because at one point, like the writing sort of stopped, and now the podcast was a little bit on a break. So what are your lessons learned that you learn about yourself? Like what is the stuff that gets you going, and what is the stuff that pretty much kills your flow?
Yeah. So first of all, I definitely struggle with consistency, and I think a lot of people can relate. I don't really have like a specific reason for that. I can make millions and millions of excuses, as you know.
Like, but tell me one or two.
In terms of excuses, I mean, I use like, I was traveling with my girlfriend, or
sure, you said that already.
Yeah, no, I mean just excuses, like when in reality there was no legitimate excuse, right? Like I could have made time. Like one thing with podcasting is I'm really good with the guests. I can schedule like 10 interviews by tomorrow, but the editing is something that I really struggle with because it's just so time consuming for me. Maybe I'll pull out an item out of your book and just not edit at all. But just editing is really a time consuming. Like it's just very hard to sit down and edit and listen to yourself talk, which is something that's a little bit awkward for me.
Yeah.
I like talking, but like just listening to yourself, oh, I said that wrong. Oh, like it's very awkward.
Yeah, that's true.
Just getting in a flow of editing is something that's a big issue for me, and that's kind of it.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting because I decided to not edit at all. I have no clue about editing. I'm already glad that I can hear you, that you can hear me, and that I can record it. For me, in my book, that's already enough. At one point, it might not maybe be such a good quality for the audience, but I'm more like the guy where I realized I just do it, and then after a few months, I realized, wait a minute, I should have done this in the first place, but I didn't. And like the way how I do it is usually I try to get momentum with not necessarily with a shitty product, but with something where I'm saying, okay, this is still good quality content, but I'm not gonna make it a perfect thing because I know I will never be able to make something perfect. So it's interesting. And also, like hearing myself talk, I always think like, man, who is this guy? Who does he think he is? Like when I hear myself, I think like, wait a minute, this is such a douchebag. Like who invited this guy to the party even?
Yeah, and you can tweak it along the way too. And I love your approach, to be honest. And that's what I wish I'd done 2-3 years ago, because I would have been 100 episode deep as opposed to 30. And to be honest, I'm very pleased with where I'm at, all things considered, with the podcast. I mean, I started it, which is a good thing. I'm not going to rest on my laurels, but the fact that I've done 35 episodes is a good thing for me. But I still am hungry to kind of be consistent, like even if it's just once a week, you know. And that's one thing too. I think I was a little bit over excited to do 3 episodes a week, which isn't too much with my time constraints, but at the same time, I wasn't able to keep it up consistently. So moving forward, when I kind of get back into the swing of things, I might tone it down just a little bit and then tweak as I'm more and more consistent, if that makes sense.
Are you still scared? Because like what I realized, like this is now the 3rd episode, and every time I'm like super scared, I'm so afraid. And actually why I asked you in the beginning, the question where you did before, I actually watched Jimmy Fallon's recap of the SNL 40th anniversary. It is one of the most hilarious things I've ever seen in my life. And I watched it all the 3 episodes. I watched it before because it loosens me up. It relaxes me quite a lot. And other than that, I would be so freaking nervous, and I don't know if that stops or is it still the same even after more than 30 episodes?
Yeah, that's a good question. And aside, I actually a popular podcaster, I think Mike Cernovich, I think of Danger and Play. I just read an article about him, and he says what he does before he starts a podcast is he just talks out loud and says, "Oh, this mic is like silver, it's black," and he just starts talking about physical things to just kind of be in the present moment. Mm-hmm. And then when you hit record, it's not a big deal. So I've definitely been experimenting with that. As an aside, one of the things is I'd say For most part, I haven't really been nervous so far. There's one story I can share with you here in a second, but mostly it's just been with friends who I'd never not necessarily met in person, but I'd had a relationship with before.
Mm-hmm.
So it really wasn't that big a deal. And I'd say like 5 or 6 episodes of the podcast, I had never talked to them before doing the podcast. And for me, it's kind of comes kind of natural. I've never been super nervous. That being said, there was one point where I interviewed a New York Times bestseller, Chris Brogan. He's a popular blogger, business guy, that kind of stuff. And
Yeah,
I was able.
I listened to it. It was a great podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much, and I think you'll enjoy it even more after this story. But so he's kind of a big deal in the marketing world, and just a quick aside, I reached out. He was one of the only people I believe that I didn't really have a super warm connection with. Maybe we tweeted back once or twice, but I remember wanting to get him on the podcast. I thought his story was interesting, and he ended up again. Goes to using Twitter in an awesome way, but he tweeted out just in general, not to anyone in specific, like, "What's your podcast about?" And I was on Twitter at the time, and I was like, like, "Hey, Chris, like, I interview interesting people on my Boundless World podcast,
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, "Oh, I'm not very interesting," like, winky face, kind of just playful.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, "Okay, like, come on, Chris, like, you're being a little bit humble, whatever,
Yeah.
And then I was like, "Hey, like, normally I was just like, let's see what happens, So I was like, "Hey, Chris, you want to be on my podcast?" And then there's kind of, for the first 5-10 minutes, silence, and then I went back to my mind of like, hey, like, why would he want to be on my podcast? Like, what value can I bring to him? I know he does, like, I think he does like 5 or 6 a day, or he does a lot of podcasts at one point. And so I remember reading a blog post of his a couple months earlier that said like what he didn't like in a lot of podcasters. A lot of them were making rookie mistakes. They weren't respecting his time, all this stuff. So he did like a little rant, like, if you're a new podcaster, do these things or don't do these things. And so I tweeted back. I was like, hey, Chris, I read your article twice, to show him that I invested in him, like I knew what he was about. And immediately he's like, okay, let's set it up. And so long story short, like, we set it up, and he said like, hey, bud, like, I only give you 20 minutes, so like, please be respectful, don't go over it. And I remember when I was like so nervous when I started, and I go, hey, Chris, welcome to the, like, I started like choking, like I was sweating, like I literally was like, oh my goodness. And then I started laughing. I was like, can I start over, Chris? And he's like, yeah, bud, that's fine. Go ahead, whatever makes you happy. And immediately as I took a step back, I was like, dude, Chris is just a person, like, relax. And then, as you know, that the interview went pretty well. But I kind of edited. I should have kept that out there. But like before, it was like so nerve wracking. And then once I just got into a conversation, everything worked out.
Yeah, interesting. So you don't really have an approach. You just go with the flow.
I mean, I have a general approach. So if you've listened to my show, I have a few questions at the end. I'm not even a huge fan of that necessarily, but mostly I just kind of have a general idea of who that person is, what they want to talk about. I don't really pre-plan it ahead of time unless they want to talk about something ahead of time, but it's usually like a couple minutes before and then jump into it. But mostly just like, I like talking about what they're up to, and what stories, what they're interested in. And then I also like talking about like, hey, like, so your parents didn't want you to do this. How did you do that? I think that's where the real value lies. Buddy of mine, Nate Dam, walked across the United States, and something that was really cool, but at the same time, it's like, that's kind of weird. And so I was like, hey, man, how did you handle this? Like, was your family supportive? What did you do? And I think those are the things that the listeners out there can really relate to, is not just when it's going good, but like how they dealt with things when they were at their low point, or if they're struggling or they're indecisive, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So, but what are you working on right now except the podcast? Are you still working on other projects or?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm doing a lot of reading, kind of just reading. I'm writing a lot in the journal.
Cool. What are you reading right now?
Right now I'm reading, what was the book I was reading? I'm rereading James Altucher's Choose Yourself Wealth Guide. Really big fan of James Altucher.
Great guy.
His books have changed my life, all of his books. So I'm rereading that. I'm doing a lot of journaling. I'm actually trying to revamp my website, kind of get into email marketing a little bit. I've really neglected that. That's by far the biggest mistake I've ever made in terms of online stuff, is just not really taking my email list seriously. But again, revamping the podcast. I have 3 or 4 episodes that I have not released yet, so that's kind of my focus for now. And then ultimately, I'm really passionate about, before the end of this year, publishing a book on relationship building and networking, and then also turning that into a course of some sort.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, talking about Choose Yourself, because it's a great book, I also started like my first transformational blog post was at the end of, no, at the beginning of January 2014. It was when I was like when my girlfriend left me, when I didn't have a place to stay, blah blah blah, when I didn't have an income. I also read Choose Yourself, and I read afterward The Power of Now, Choose Yourself, and Love Yourself Like Your Life Depends on It. And after that, I wrote a blog post which was called 2013, the year where I lost myself. That was also thanks to James Altucher that I started blogging the way that I blog right now. So it's definitely an amazing book, and it's great that you read it. And have you read Love Yourself Like Your Life Depends on It?
I've read all three of them. Definitely, that was my
Great.
second favorite. I wasn't a huge fan of The Power Now. It was a little bit too new agey for
Yeah.
me. But I definitely, at that point, I did enjoy it a little bit. But just wasn't my favorite. The Love Yourself guide, I think, was fantastic, and it's just so raw. It's so refreshing. Yeah. So many people try to put on this facade of like, oh, I'm this perfect person, and it's tough, right? Like being a writer, putting yourself out there, being addicted to the likes and all that kind of stuff. It can be tough, but I think ultimately that's where the real value lies.
Yeah. So, I'd love to talk a little bit about your last post, the last thing that you wrote, because I think it's a brilliant piece, and it's not exactly like the same. I wasn't in the exact same shoes, but it's very similar to my blog post that I published in January 2014. The post when you were in New York. Can you tell a little bit about like what was going on in your life? Because I think you started a really really huge social media agency back in New York, right?
Yeah, so I can kind of walk it back, and so just as a little preface before we jump into that story, I've always really considered myself a positive person. I always try to look on the bright side, always been obsessed with personal development, that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, I do struggle from on and off depression, and that's something that really is kind of hard for me to admit because I do consider myself such a positive person. A lot of times everyone thinks if you're depressed, like you're just this negative Nancy, like you hate everything. And from my experience, like depression is more than that. It's these huge highs and oftentimes like very, very low lows. And so my kind of big moment in terms of being in a dark place kind of occurred in New York. I just moved out to New York on a whim to start an awesome job at a social media agency with Gary Vaynerchuk. I was super pumped about it. And within just a few months of being there, in general, in New York and that kind of stuff, it just wasn't for me. The city was a little bit too intense for me. I was definitely kind of struggling to get in the flow with the work job. I had some amazing coworkers, that kind of stuff. But ultimately, the job fit just wasn't right for me. And because I had such a unique story to getting my first job, like trading 5 Super Nintendo games to Gary Vaynerchuk, like I had put so much like emphasis on this job, like that job defined me, like I'm set, like oh, I'm amazing, And when those difficult times, and let's be honest, there's gonna be difficult times in wherever you are, what a new job, that kind of stuff. But I just really took it too personal of like not getting into the swing of things, and I really took it hard on myself, and so that kind of sent me into kind of a downward spiral of just feeling sorry for myself, being lonely. New York is a city of paradoxes. It's the most busy city in the world, but also at many times the most loneliness. So I kind of just struggled to get my shit together, if that makes sense. And so I got into some really bad habits, picked up smoking, got into some gambling. I just was a wreck, And honestly, that's when I actually read Choose Yourself, James's first book on the subway, and it really kind of said like, whoa, take a step back, that kind of stuff.
Wow. So that's what helped you get out of your dark place, or?
I mean, at that point, yes, and I'm not by no means am I like over my depression by any means. It's definitely just a swing of things. I'm definitely going to have to be dealing with a lot of this throughout the rest of my life, but I've definitely improved quite a bit. I've quit smoking in the last few months, which is a great kind of first step. Haven't gambled, that kind of stuff, but ultimately just realized that like my job or whatever doesn't define me. And so that was a pretty big realization for me.
Yeah, that was like one of the next questions that I'd had, because you said back then your job defined you, but what do you think defines you right now?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out, So I had a really quick history of jumping around. So after VaynerMedia, I worked at another startup that ultimately didn't work out as well for a variety of different reasons. We don't need to talk about that here, but Then I moved to South America through a friend who was starting an entrepreneurship program in Chile. So I got to meet like dozens of really cool people doing awesome things in Chile. Actually I met my girlfriend there in Santiago, which was fantastic.
Oh, nice. She's from there?
Yeah, so we're still dating to this day. And so that really was a highlight in my last few years, is meeting a fantastic woman who's just been by my side, encouraging me to do all my projects, helping me with the podcast, that kind of stuff. So I'm still trying to find myself. So to be honest, I'm back at home right now in Arizona. I'm just working some small jobs here and there, just trying to get my feet together and just really get back into, again, writing and podcasting, because ultimately those are the two of my biggest passions. And for the last 4 or 5 years, which is a long time, I've let that kind of go to the side. But I'm at the point where I just need to kind of get back in a routine, kind of work on myself and continue to improve. That's all you can really ask for.
Yeah, true. And I think it doesn't really matter from where you are, right? Right now, like I'm podcasting from my mom's house back in Munich because I don't have a place of my own anymore. So I'm also like, you can take over the world from everywhere. It's also an interesting story that you're sharing here. So what I think, what defines you is more your writing. I don't know why I keep pushing on that button.
I love it, and I intuitively I know it. Like I enjoy. I just have been so scared and so like defeated. Like I'm afraid, but at the same time, like it's like I know they'll be okay. So I agree with you, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I was also thinking that like the writing is you, that's your true self, but like the podcasts, sometimes I'm not quite sure. Like, well, do you think that maybe the podcast distracted you from who you really are, or do you think it helped you to get where you want to be?
I think the podcast has been a huge positive, right? So whether or not the show's been like authentic, so to speak, I honestly can say most of them have just been legitimate conversations. They may not be perceived that way, but ultimately, like I've become a significantly better communicator going through it. So I don't think they're necessarily related. I think I can write and do the podcast at the same time. I'm definitely trying to still find my style and voice. It's still very early on in the podcasting days. But for the most part, I'm very pleased with how it's turned on. I don't think I'm like trying to copy any podcast or anything like that. So to answer your question, I think it's been the most authentic me in terms of that medium, right?
Yeah.
So the voice, audio, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's true. Like podcast and writing is a bit different, and I think, or I'd be the first reader of your book. I don't know what you want to call it, but I'd definitely be the first reader to even get like no, I cannot really edit it because I'm not, like, English is not my mother tongue, but
no, man, that means a lot to me. Truly, I'm smiling ear to ear right now.
Yeah, so I would love to read that book, and I think I'm not going to say like, okay, it should be in this or that fashion, because it seems like you've gone through a lot of difficult and hard times, like, and a lot of people went through similar things, and I think a lot of people could even learn from it, from like, how do you even, like, first of all, like, how did you even get up after you struggled in New York? I think that would be like, at least I'd push it.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned that, because one of my biggest articles was the like kind of coming out of the closet, so to speak, of like I struggled with depression, I was embarrassed to share it, blah blah blah. But I can't tell you, I've probably got literally 20 or 30 messages from people who I hadn't talked to in a while. Even family members are like, man, like I didn't know this, I just struggled with this too, you know. And it was just such a, I don't want to use the term rewarding, because I don't want to say it's rewarding that other people were sad and depressed. But like it was just such a good feeling to know that I wasn't alone, so a selfish reason there, and two, that like people reached out to me and like, man, like I struggle with this too, and like I really like appreciate how you like framed it this way and that way, and like I think that's so important. And I think one of the biggest things and why I kind of stopped writing is when I found some early success in year 3, 4 of the blog, I actually ended up taking over a very popular personal development blog, Plugin ID.
Sorry, I didn't get it. What did you?
Sorry?
I didn't understand. What did you do? I didn't get it.
So Glenn Alsop is an internet marketer and owner of ViperChill.com. Really kind of awesome guy. But
I came across his blog recently. Yeah, true.
Yeah, in college he ran a personal development blog called Plugin ID, and at the time it was one of the most popular. It's like not even working at this point, but it was one of the most popular personal development blogs in the world. And Glenn and I connected, and he's like, hey, I love your writing. You want to write for Plugin ID? Like, okay. So I became like the sole writer of Plugin ID.
Oh, wow.
it was such like a kind of ego trip for me. I actually started changing my writing style, kind of just like Me Too content, like kind of crap, and it kind of really stuck with me. And people emailed me like, dude, this article sucks. And it wasn't like this article stinks. It's like, yeah, this is just like phony. Like, what are you doing? And so I was like, man, this sucks. And so I went back to Boundless World, and I just, again, the momentum, I think that's an ever occurring theme, and why I respect your approach so much is like momentum will carry you through all that kind of stuff. And it's so difficult when you have like a full stop to gain that momentum back. Again, it's not impossible, but just momentum is such a huge catalyst to growth and success, in my opinion.
What do you understand exactly by momentum? Like, and how do you get it?
Sorry?
What do you understand exactly by momentum, and how do you get there?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think momentum, again, ties into consistency. And so regardless of what you do, like you're going to have to show up not every day, right? You don't have to write every day, but you have to show up more often than not for a significant period of time. So years even before people are going to start really realizing who you are and all that kind of stuff. And to be honest, sometimes after years of work, you still might not be noticed. So you have to do the work without really knowing for sure what's going to happen in the future. And that's very hard in an age of uncertainty and choices and stuff. Like you have millions of choices. Why would I write an article when I can watch any show I want on Netflix? You know? Yeah. And so you have to like consciously make the decision to have the discipline to follow through. And I've failed in many regards in that, but there have been periods in my life where I've gone like 1-2 years very consistent. And I feel like that consistency and momentum, so to speak, is like the highlights of my life. You know, it shows that I've been disciplined. And so I think a lot of my kind of I'm not a doctor by any means, but I think the times I found myself struggling the most is when I lacked identity and discipline. And so I think those two are very tied in together. Is just when you're consistent regardless of the outcome, and it ties into like the way I view relationships and networking is like adding value to people's lives is something you can do at any time to whoever you want. And so if you just do that without expectation, a lot of that stuff comes back to you. And so I'm very, very passionate about just showing up, putting in the work without expectation, and it's very difficult to do as a human being who wants like certainty.
So would you say that quick growth is something bad? Because apparently like it killed your vibe sometimes or your flow.
Right? I wouldn't say, I mean, growth is good in a lot of ways.
Like
I think,
growth,
yes,
like
you have to be able to handle it, right? If you find success overnight, like there's story after story of, this is somewhat of relatable, but story after story of people winning the lottery in the U.S. who are broke within the next 2 to 5 years. Like I'm talking about 70 or 80 lottery winners of millions of dollars or more are literally 80% of them or 90% of them are broke within 2 to 5 years. Like that just blows my mind. And so if you're not set up for success to kind of handle it, it can be detrimental. And so you have to have systems in place, just being consistent, kind of having kind of the idea that knowing you're going to grow, that kind of stuff. But I think growth is good because you're going to learn from those experiences. If you have growth and then you take a few steps back, like that's better than no growth at all.
Yeah. You got to work on the foundation first, right? And the foundation Absolutely. Usually takes like so long. Like even I sometimes ask myself, like, dude, what are you even doing here? Like nothing's going on.
Gary Vaynerchuk did his Wine Library TV show. Apparently, he did a daily show for like 18 months and like a couple thousand viewers. Like no one watched it, and then he really caught on. He got on Conan, Ellen, and all that kind of stuff. And so I think there's a theme. Like one of the biggest things I see all the time is like I got really into blogging right when blogs were taking off, and I remember like kind of like being an idiot, like laughing at these people, like this guy sucks at writing. Ha ha ha. Now he's one of the most popular bloggers. Like it's just the consistency. You know, there's so many people who have the talent. I consider I have a little bit of talent, but I wasn't consistent, you know, and so I've made results, but I haven't been as successful as I want to be because of the consistency. And so regardless of whatever you do, you just have to be consistent. You have to show up even when you're not seeing results. And again, you can change, you can like take breaks, all that kind of stuff, but like you have to have an idea like I'm going to be consistent no matter what life throws in my way. And those are the people and the stories that really stand out.
Yeah. Do you think that blogging is still worth it, that it's still possible to sort of stand out with blogging? And if so, like how would you start a new blog? Like let's say you didn't do anything, you know what you know today, like you'd start a completely new project, a completely new blog. How would you start it right away? Or do you even think it's worth it, or would you do something else? Like
so I think blogging is absolutely worth it right now. But to preface it, I think a lot of people think everyone can be successful at a blog, and that's not true. Like to be a truly successful blog, there has to be a lot of different things involved.
Like what?
There's luck,
Yeah.
there's relationships, there's your social skills, your writing skills, your expertise. Like not everyone can just be this A-list blogger. But for me, I encourage people to give that a try, because if you give it a try and like if my friend tells me he wants to like play in the NFL, like I'll say like give it a shot, and in some instances I'll be like, hey man, maybe not. It depends on the person. But I'm saying like you can always try it, and if it doesn't work, have the self-awareness to kind of take a step back. But to answer your question, like I absolutely think it's possible to stand out in the blogging world today. I do think it's significantly harder than it was 2, 3, 4 years ago. And so there is a lot more competition, but there's people doing this every day. It's just you have to start somewhere, trailblaze your own path, that kind of stuff.
So how would you start today?
So to start today, I would leverage from scratch. And so I would probably build a blog around networking, kind of relationships, that kind of stuff, and kind of be very niche. I think to really kill it in the blogging world today, you have to be very, very small, start out in a niche, kill that niche, and then leverage that expertise in other areas. So if you'll notice, like Derek Halpern of Social Triggers, he did a really good job at this. And he started out with like psychology. He was always talking about psychology. He became an expert of psychology and marketing. And then he was able to leverage that, because once you're an expert in one thing, psychology will tell you that people will perceive you as an expert in areas that you might not even know about, right? Mm-hmm. So Ramit Sethi of I Will Teach You to Be Rich, he started out a finance blogger. He killed it at finance, and now he's talking about food and exercise. So once you like kill it at a small niche, the biggest mistake now, and something I would avoid if I started over, is just like, oh, I'm a personal development travel business blogger. Like, no one's going to read that. No one's going to really care. But if I go like one specific route and leverage that expertise, then you can expand to other things. Because no one wants to write a blog about the same exact thing for 5-10 years. You're going to evolve as a person. Your interests are going to evolve. But so to kind of wrap it up, the first thing would be very niche. I would talk about specifically like networking, that kind of stuff. Even get more specific there. And then the second would be definitely taking email list subscribers seriously, getting an opt-in, that kind of stuff, because that's where the engagement's at. With so many blogs, millions, billions, trillions of blogs these days, not everyone really goes back to the website all the time. So even if they're a huge fan of yours, so if you get their email, you're going to be on top of mind more and more. So those are my two biggest tips. And then the third one, to wrap it up here, would just be leverage your relationships. And fortunately, I've been able to connect with a lot of people, so I do a lot of guest posting, podcast. I would actually probably focus on podcasting for my marketing strategy these days. I read an excellent post by Nick Loper of Side Hustle Nation, and he was saying guest posting are effective, but they're very time consuming. So get on podcast, right? So I would literally hit up hundreds of people, email them, build relationships, get on their podcast, talk about my awesome networking blog. And the benefit of that is on their website, they're going to link back to your site. So you'll get some SEO boost, that kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of different ways. So again, email list, being very niche, and leveraging my relationships or your relationships.
So that I did not do any. I mean, I collected email addresses, but I did the complete opposite, because I don't have really a topic. I'd say I don't have a niche. Do you say niche or niche? How
niche,
do you say
niche. I think.
It's interesting because but maybe that's also why I'm not successful.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference. There's the artistic value of writing every day and that kind of stuff. But if you're trying, and then I'm in the same boat. I'm not making significant money at all, maybe $50, $100 here or there online. But if there's a difference between the artistic value and then the business value. And in my opinion, and from the people I've talked to, like email list is where the money's at in terms of selling products, that kind of stuff. Because if you just send out a post on your blog with no like solid funnel, then no one's going to really like show up in a very significant way, in my opinion.
Yeah, interesting. So, you mentioned before, like during the conversation, you mentioned something, and it's interesting because I took the exact same note while I went through some of your writings. You said there's so many opportunities. At the end of the day, we don't do anything. And what I read, and I even put it on a piece of paper, with endless opportunity, we're so overwhelmed and scared to death of coming up short that we do nothing. That was a really inspiring post, I have to say. Small sentence, I have to say. And it was from your blog. Do you remember?
I don't remember, to be honest. I kind of vaguely remember it, but it was probably 3, 4, 5 years ago.
It was? Did I go that? I didn't know I read that much, but... So, do you think that this is a specific problem from our or your generation, and also in case of yourself? That, oh, you have blogs. I could write a blog post. I could make a podcast. I could make a book. Because I catch myself over and over again, that I'm thinking at 10 different things at the same time. Oh, I want to write this blog post. I want to make a podcast. I want to make like I have 5, 6, 7 websites at the same time. But then just to get it started, one new thing, it takes me months and months. Just simply starting this freaking podcast. It took me like 5 months before I started. Do you think that's like a general problem of our generation right now?
I think it's a huge problem, and it's something so many people struggle with. I think there's two parts to your question. There's a consumer procrastination problem and a producing procrastination problem. The consumer is the idea is like, I need to have this one article is going to teach me how to be successful, so I'm going to read 1,000,000. Oh, this article is better. Like, this course is good. Like, I know people who buy dozens of like premium courses and don't even open them past the first week. You know, there's just so many options, and it's easier to like say you're researching or you're trying to educate yourself than actually do something, right? So it's a kind of crutch, an excuse to not really put yourself out there. So that's the consumer problem. And the producing problem, yes. I mean, there's so many opportunities like, oh, instead of a Fiverr gig, make $5 here, write an ebook, all this kind of stuff. And that's definitely overwhelming. And so I think truly to be successful in this business world or just successful in general is you have to have incredible focus. And Warren Buffett, obviously famous investor, he says the biggest thing to him success is reading and saying no. And I think just having the ability to say no to these various projects, especially if you're just getting started online, like a lot of times you'll get started and then there'll be a small money making opportunity. You're like, man, like this is cool. Yes. And then you waste 6 months on a project that doesn't even pan out. And so I do think like, especially millennials, 20 to 30, even 40 to 50, like there's just so much information out there. It's very hard to know what's legit, what's not. And so for me, like I'm really trying to focus on just being minimalist in not only my physical possessions, but also just what I'm focusing on. And so for me right now, it's just getting my writing back into the flow and then podcasting. And one or two items are pretty strong in my view.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, like the two sides with the consumer and the producer. I didn't really distinguish it yet so far, but I have to admit that totally makes sense because like my approach is I don't consume anything, but I didn't really strictly like yeah, the what's the word, make a difference between producing and consuming. But I don't consume anything. I don't read any blog posts. I know it sounds selfish, but I don't read anything on Facebook. I don't read any blog posts, and I don't really buy anything. So maybe that's like one way why I'm able to consistently produce content, because I don't consume content. And yeah, I did really disagree that it's like a light bulb going up above my head.
Yeah, I mean, like I try not to consume, but I think like we're trained to be consumers, right? And so it's very hard to like step back and say I can produce again, because once you start producing, you enter an entirely different arena. Anyone can consume all that kind of stuff, but when you produce, you have to face yourself, you have to face the public. There's a lot of like public pressure, right? Am I good enough? There's a lot of these invisible scripts, as Ramit Sethi likes to say. And so again, I think it's amazing what you've been doing. And honestly, you're one of the few people I read on Facebook. Like every time you write something, I'll stop and read it. Just because it's so fresh, it's so real, and it's not all about like I'm perfect, follow my steps. It's like, hey, today sucked, done. You know, like I think that's super important. And at the same time, my business and marketing mind, like that's something I struggle with too. Is like when I was dealing with this depression, like I could talk about these things, but part of it I felt like a fraud, that kind of stuff. And so I think when you're writing, you just have to stay.
Why do you feel like a fraud? I don't get it.
Yeah, it's something I can't really articulate. Like it's just like especially when I was writing about personal development stuff, it's like why can I write about this stuff and I haven't even figured my life out, when that was like the completely wrong approach. It's like I should be writing about this stuff because I don't have my life figured out, and that's what's going to be relatable, you know. There's a psychological study of like an infomercial where there's two tests. This one girl was like this brand new knife, like chopping up these onions and that kind of stuff. And so they did that. The sales weren't that good. And then they redid the video, and the girl was chopping up the onions and stuff, and she dropped her knife and like spilled like spaghetti on her blouse. And people actually bought like double, triple, or quadruple the amount of those knives. And the reason is because she's human. You know, the first video
Yeah.
was a little bit robotic, and the girl who spilled spaghetti, it's like, oh man, I just spilled spaghetti last night. I'll buy this knives. And so for me, it's internalizing like, hey, no matter where I'm at in life, I can be a writer. I am a writer, and just putting words to paper. And that's something just this podcast has made me realize. Talking with you is like, I should stop being so afraid.
Yeah, I mean, it is true because like the way how I started, like I can tell for I don't know like 1.5 years, like on my LinkedIn account it says I'm an investor. I don't even have money to invest, but I put it there. I also put agent of change there a few years ago. I put a writer there. I put author there. I put speaker there, and I was none of it. But just by putting it somewhere and visualizing it and seeing it, and sometimes even laughing about myself because I said I'm an investor. I even get people that approach me on LinkedIn and send me their business plans, but I don't have any freaking cent to invest. Like
Fake
what I
it till you
usually,
make it.
yeah, what I usually send them is an article I wrote, investments I made in 2014, and what it says is I only invested in myself. And I guess that's like that's like at least my strategy, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Like I just say everybody, yeah, I'm a speaker, even though I have no clue about speaking. Just recently, I saw a video of one of my talks, and it was terrible. I was talking about so many things. I was like, I didn't really understand what I was saying. But people afterwards came to me and said like, "Oh wow, that was amazing." But I thought it was just bullshit. And I think it's really about visualizing it and just like getting yourself out there. And it's also that most people out there, they're even worse than you are. Not even worse, but I think that they don't, they're afraid of getting out there. And the thing is that most people, according to my experience, that's how I went through university. I always thought I'm such a bad student, but I learned to not underestimate the weaknesses of others.
Yeah,
Which is
that sounds kind of like I totally get what you're saying, but yeah, it makes sense, right? Like especially in the social media age, like everyone's just pushing their best foot forward all the time, and that's why when you do take a step back and share, like, hey, today sucks, like people are like, wow, my day did suck, like I get this, you know, and I think it's so common to like position yourself, especially on the online world. It's kind of a new phenomenon and just like so fake, you know, like
yeah,
everything's going so good, and tying like especially like these life coaches and things like that. I have a huge issue with it just because a lot of times they position themselves so fakely. And I've been victim to that too. I positioned myself when I wasn't happy, like I was the happiest person in the world. There's part marketing, part salesmanship, but at the same time, like you have to be a real person. And I know that gets everyone talks about that all the time, but so few people do that. Is when you really put like what's going on in your mind. And granted, like no one wants you to complain every single day in a blog post. Like no one's gonna like that. You have to have a balance. But if you're really dedicated to growth and improving yourself, and you share those journeys, in my experience, that's where people really relate. Is like, hey, it's not going so great. It's getting better. It's getting better. Up, it went down. Up, it's getting better and getting better. They join your journey.
yeah, dude. Do you know what I was just thinking about? I was thinking like, man, what will the headline be of this podcast? I have no freaking idea. We talk about so many cool things.
I loved it.
How do I put this thing in like 5 or 6 words? I don't know. I'd probably need like a 10-page headline, but then nobody will read it or listen to it.
75 things we talked about.
Yeah, that would be an overkill. Yeah. So, but what are your next steps? What can we like? What should we check out? What can we see? Where can we sign up to your email list, dude, buddy? You need to start building your email list.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can head on over to boundlessworld.com, ABOUNDLESS world, WORLD.com. By the time of this publishing over the next couple of days, I'll have a nice email list signed up. Sign up for networking, personal development, all that good stuff. Really would love to have you there. Also, my podcast will be launched with a few new episodes by the time of this posting as well. You can find that, the Boundless World podcast, at my blog or on iTunes, whichever you prefer. And really, those are the two main projects right now. And in the next few months, keep an eye out for a book on relationship building and networking. That's something I'm super passionate about and looking forward to sharing with the world.
I'll definitely send it out to my email list. And also like all of the things I tried making notes, like all the people that you mentioned. I'm also going to edit them at the end of the podcast so that people can follow up. And you gotta shoot me an email afterwards with all of the stuff that you said.
Of course. And also, if please, if you're listening to this, jump on Twitter and connect with me. I love talking to anyone and everyone just about whatever's going on. So at A Boundless World, I'm always on Twitter and definitely very responsive there. So if you want to get in touch, please do so.
Awesome, dude. I'm not even connecting with you on Twitter, am I?
I'm not sure. I think I'm following you at one point.
But you should not, because it's an automated account.
Yeah, I usually unfollow automated people.
Yeah, every hour it sends out a tweet. Dude, you still there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Oh, okay, great. So, well, thanks so much for coming in on the show. It was a great podcast. Is all I can say.
It's my pleasure, man. It was a fantastic hour of my day. Thanks so much.
All right, same here, but talk to you soon.